Mars Incorporated is one of the largest, most secretive, and most successful private companies in the world, with annual revenues of $45 billion. Its identity is a paradox. It is a family company that was forged by a bitter family conflict. The company's most iconic product, M&M's, is a global symbol of fun and childlike joy. Yet its creation was a masterstroke of industrial opportunism, born from observations of the Spanish Civil War and built to profit from the logistical needs of the Second World War. This is the story of how a father's candy bar and a son's wartime innovation created a multi-generational, multi-billion-dollar empire. The exiled son's conquest. The history of M&M's cannot be told without understanding the history of the Mars family, a dynasty defined by ambition, secrecy, and a deep recurring internal conflict. The company's origin begins in 1911, not with M&M's, but with Frank C. Mars. Frank, who had learned to hand-dip candy as a child, founded the Mars Candy Factory in 1911 in Tacoma, Washington. His early ventures were failures. It was not until 1920, after moving to Minneapolis, Minnesota, that he found his first major success. In 1923, Frank C. Mars and his son, Forrest Mars Sr., developed the Milky Way bar. The Milky Way was a revolutionary product, combining chocolate, caramel, and a light nougat center. It was a massive hit and became the financial bedrock of the Mars Company. However, this success was not the beginning of a happy partnership, but the cause of a deep personal schism. Frank C. Mars was a company man of his era, content to build a successful domestic business. His son, Forrest Sr., was a volatile, ambitious, and ruthless visionary. Forrest, a Yale-educated engineer, saw his father's company as inefficient and small-minded. He had global ambitions and a combative, autocratic personality. This led to constant, explosive arguments. In 1932, the conflict became untenable. Frank C. Mars, in an attempt to end the fighting, gave his son $50,000 and the international rights to the Milky Way bar, and, in effect, banished him from the U.S. company. Forrest Mars Sr. took his $50,000 and moved to England. This exile was the true beginning of the M&M's story. In the 1930s, Forrest built his own separate company in the UK, Mars Limited, manufacturing the Mars bar for the British market. It was during this time in the late 1930s that Forrest traveled to Spain during the Spanish Civil War. The legend states that Forrest observed soldiers eating small chocolate-covered pellets. These were likely a version of Smarties, a British candy. What he observed was not the candy itself, but a brilliant piece of operational design. The chocolate was coated in a hard panned sugar shell. This shell was a low-cost, low-tech solution to a massive industrial problem, melting. It made the chocolate thermally stable, allowing it to be transported and eaten in warm climates by hand without creating a mess. For a man obsessed with efficiency and military-grade logistics, this was an epiphany. In 1940, as World War II began to engulf Europe, Forrest Mars Sr. returned to the United States. His father, Frank, had died in 1934, and the U.S. Mars Company was now controlled by his stepmother. He was still, in effect, an outsider. He set up his own new U.S. company in Newark, New Jersey. He had the Spanish idea, but he needed one critical component that was now being heavily rationed by the looming war: chocolate. To solve this, he formed a partnership that would become the stuff of legend. He approached Bruce Murray, the son of William Murray, the president of Hershey's. Hershey's, as a dominant force, had better access to the rationed chocolate supply. In 1941, Forrest Mars Sr. and Bruce Murray founded a new company. The name was a simple combination of their own, Mars and Murray's, or M and M's. This partnership was a brilliant strategic move. Murray's 20% stake in the company was not just an investment. It was, as the user outline analyzes, a supply chain solution. The Hershey's connection guaranteed a stable, priority supply of chocolate, reducing Mars's raw material risk by an estimated 40% during a period of intense wartime rationing. The product itself was launched in 1941. The core marketing slogan, as the outline notes, was "Melts in your mouth, not in your hand." This was not just a clever jingle, it was the entire unique selling proposition. It was a direct, explicit statement of the product's functional advantage. The company's first and most important customer was the United States military. The timing of the 1941 launch was perfect. The U.S. was entering World War II, and the military was desperately searching for a high-energy, morale-boosting food ration that could be shipped to soldiers in the Pacific and North Africa without melting. M&Ms were the solution. The cardboard tube packaged candy was sold exclusively to the U.S. military for the duration of the war. This military contract was the foundation of the brand's success. It accounted for over 70% of the company's initial revenue. Mars was shipping millions of packages per week to soldiers overseas. This was a government-funded multi-million-dollar product sampling campaign. It was the most effective product launch in candy history. An entire generation of American soldiers, the GI generation, was being trained to associate M&Ms with comfort, home, and victory. When World War II ended in 1945, M&M's faced its first great pivot. Its exclusive government-funded contract with the U.S. military was over. However, an entire generation of 16 million American GIS was returning home, all of whom had been trained for 4 years to associate the small candy-coated chocolates with comfort and morale. This created a massive, pre-built, and intensely loyal civilian customer base. Forrest Mars Sr. immediately pivoted to the public market. The wartime cardboard tube was replaced with the familiar brown paper pouch. The company also benefited from the 1941 patent it had secured for the panning process, the method of creating the hard sugar shell. This patent gave M&M's a critical multi-year legal monopoly. Competitors, even its former partner Hershey's, could not easily copy the product during its initial explosive growth phase. This combination of a battle-tested product, a loyal customer base, and a legal patent shield created a perfect storm for success. In 1948, Forrest Mars Sr., in a characteristic move of consolidating power, bought out Bruce Murray's 20% stake in the company. The partnership was dissolved. Hershey's, which had been the brand's crucial ally for securing ration chocolate, was now its primary competitor. With the company now fully under his control, Forrest Mars Sr. initiated the second great innovation in the brand's history. The first innovation had been functional. Melts in your mouth, not in your hand. This was a practical slogan that solved a real-world problem. But the 1950s was the dawn of a new, powerful medium, television. To conquer this new visual market, the brand needed more than a slogan. It needed a personality. In 1954, M&M's launched one of the most successful advertising campaigns of all time. It introduced the animated M&M's spokes candies. This was a revolutionary marketing pivot. The brand's mascots were not children or celebrities or cartoon animals. The product itself was the character. This was a brilliant move that created a direct emotional bond between the consumer and the candy. The first characters were the plain M&M and the first peanut M&M, which was introduced to promote the new peanut-filled version of the candy that same year. This marketing strategy was an explosive success. It perfectly targeted the two most important demographics of the post-war boom, children and parents. This new character-driven marketing, combined with the post-war suburban boom, created a decade of staggering growth. As the data indicates, this strategy was the primary driver of a 500% increase in sales during the 1950s. M&M's was no longer just a functional military ration. It had transformed into a beloved American cultural icon. While Forrest Mars Sr. was building this M&M's empire, a company that was legally separate and distinct, his father's original company, Mars Incorporated, was still operating, run by his stepmother, Ethel Fiv Mars. Forrest's company, which he had built from scratch during his exile, was now a global powerhouse. He was famously autocratic, secretive, and obsessed with quality and efficiency, running his factories with a level of clinical precision that was unheard of in the industry. By the early 1960s, Forrest's company was far more successful and dynamic than his father's stagnant, U.S.-focused Mars Inc. The family drama that had begun in 1932, with his father banishing him to England, was about to reach its conclusion. In 1964, Forrest Mars Sr., now one of the wealthiest men in the world, returned to the company that had cast him out. He used his massive fortune, built on M&Ms, to buy out the remaining shareholders of his father's original company. He then took his own, larger, more profitable company and merged it with his father's, consolidating the two entities into the modern, global, and privately held corporation, Mars Incorporated. This 1964 merger was the final victory for Forrest Mars Sr. He had not just built a rival empire, he had conquered the one that had exiled him. The formation of the brand was complete. It was a company forged by family conflict, built on a wartime logistical innovation, and scaled to global dominance by a revolutionary character marketing strategy. This new, consolidated, and intensely secretive private empire was now the largest candy company in the world, but it would soon face a new, complex set of 21st century challenges. What is Mars's $45 billion secret weapon? The 1964 consolidation, when Forrest Mars Sr. bought out his father's company, was not a simple family reunion. It was a conquest. It unified the two Mars empires, Mars Incorporated and M&M's, under a single autocratic ruler. This event, which ended the decades-long family drama, also cemented the single most important and defining characteristic of the Mars Corporation: its intense, almost paranoid secrecy. Mars Incorporated is not a public company. It is one of the largest privately held corporations in the world, with $45 billion in annual revenue. It is 100% owned and controlled by the Mars family, a dynasty that is famously one of the richest and most reclusive in America. This private status is the source of all the company's internal drama. It is its greatest strength and its most profound weakness. Because the company is private, it is completely insulated from the short-term, quarterly demands of Wall Street shareholders. This allows the Mars family to operate on a multi-generational timeline, making massive, long-term investments in quality and sustainability that a public CEO facing a quarterly earnings call could never justify. This philosophy is enshrined in the company's 5 principles: quality, responsibility, mutuality, efficiency, and freedom. This is not just corporate PR. It is the family constitution. However, this privacy also creates a culture of insularity. The company is notoriously opaque. It does not have to disclose its financials in detail. It does not have to explain its strategic pivots, and its leadership transitions are decided in secret by a small, unelected board of family members. This creates a kingdom mentality. The internal drama of the company is therefore a story of generational transition, When Forrest Mars Sr. retired in 1973, he did so in a way that defined the family's control issues. He was physically incapable of letting go. He immediately founded a new company, Ethel M. Chocolates, just to stay in the game and compete with his own sons, Forrest Jr. and John, whom he had just put in charge. The leadership of Forrest Jr. and John Mars was a long, stable, and highly profitable era. They expanded the company into a global behemoth, most notably by acquiring the Wrigley Company in 2008 and massively expanding the company's most profitable division, pet food. This diversification into pet care was a masterstroke, a decision that now accounts for 50% of the company's total revenue. It was a long-term, non-public move that a Wall Street-driven company might have resisted, the 2022 redesign crisis. But this family control model also creates slow decision-making. The company is a supertanker, and the family board must agree before the direction can change. This insularity and slowness is what made the company vulnerable to the 21st century's high-speed cultural shifts. This weakness was exposed in the modern era, culminating in the 2022 leadership crisis. In September 2022, the company announced that its longtime CEO, Grant Reed, would be retiring. Reed had overseen a decade of massive growth. The timing, however, was not a coincidence. Reed's exit was announced just months after the company had become embroiled in a massive self-inflicted public relations disaster, the 2022 M&M's redesign. The internal drama was clear. A major public-facing marketing decision had backfired, and the CEO was taking the fall. The company, in its classic opaque Mars fashion, provided no details. But this sudden top-down leadership change, which came in the middle of a massive public controversy, created chaos within the company. As the user's data indicates, the internal confusion and low morale resulting from this redesign drama led to a staggering 60% increase in employee turnover in key marketing and brand divisions. Employees were caught in the crossfire of a culture war that, internally, felt like a massive unforced error. This internal chaos was a direct result of the external crisis. The external challenge began in January 2022. The M&M's Spokescandies, which had been introduced in 1954, were one of the most successful, beloved, and neutral pieces of branding in the world. The company's marketing team, in an attempt to rebrand the characters for a modern, inclusive Gen Z audience, announced a global purpose-led update. The changes were subtle, but culturally explosive. The green M&M, a character who had been sexualized in previous ads, had her high-heeled go-go boots swapped for cool, laid-back sneakers. The brown M&M's high-heeled stilettos were swapped for lower block heels. The reason, the company stated, was to make the female characters more representative of the consumer and empowered. The company also introduced a new, inclusive purple M&M character, representing acceptance, who was widely interpreted as the brand's first LGBTQ+ mascot. This was a deliberate attempt to pivot the brand from family-friendly fun to progressive woke capitalism. The company, whose Mars principles include responsibility, saw this as a necessary modernizing move. It was a catastrophic miscalculation of its own audience. The backlash was not at first from all consumers. It was specific, targeted, and weaponized by the American right-wing media. Commentators, most notably Tucker Carlson on Fox News, seized on the redesign as a prime example of woke corporate overreach. Carlson and other conservative voices, in a series of viral segments, ridiculed the company. They accused M&M's of desexifying the female characters, of kowtowing to a progressive mob, and of being unfun. This was not a marketing problem, it was a political one. M&M's had successfully and accidentally made itself a central exhibit in the American culture war. The brand, which had been neutral for 70 years, was now politicized. This led to immediate, real-world consequences. A boycott was called for by conservative consumers who felt the brand was insulting their values. This boycott, as the data indicates, had a direct and measurable financial impact. The company's sales in the U.S. market, a market that accounts for 40% of its global revenue, suffered a 2 to 5% drop. The 2022 redesign scandal was the most visible, high-impact, and self-inflicted crisis in the brand's modern history. The 2 to 5% drop in U.S. sales was a direct financial consequence of the company's decision to politicize its neutral, family-friendly brand. The 30% increase in social criticism was a clear metric of this failure. But the woke capitalism boycott was not the only external challenge the company faced. It was simply a new crisis layered on top of a much older, more dangerous, and more fundamental threat: the war on sugar. While the redesign drama was a political problem, Mars Inc. has been fighting a long-term health problem. As one of the largest candy manufacturers in the world, the company is at the epicenter of the global public health crisis surrounding sugar, obesity, and type 2 diabetes. This is not a new challenge. For decades, the company has faced persistent criticism for marketing high-sugar, high-calorie products, particularly to children, using its fun cartoon spokes candies. This health challenge is a far greater long-term threat than a temporary political boycott. It has created a massive, permanent legal and financial burden. As the data indicates, the company has faced a steady increase in regulatory pressure, leading to an estimated $50 million per year in new legal and compliance costs between 2023 and 2025. This includes costs associated with new sugar tax legislation in various countries, lawsuits from consumer advocacy groups, and the expensive mandatory reformulation of products to meet new health guidelines. The redesign crisis was so damaging because it was a war on two fronts. The company was now being simultaneously attacked by the political right for being too woke and too inclusive, and by the health-conscious public and progressive left for being a primary purveyor of unhealthy junk food. The brand was caught in a pincer movement. Its attempt to modernize and include was seen as a hollow, hypocritical act by critics who pointed out that the core product, a candy-coated sugar pellet, was still contributing to a public health epidemic. This vulnerability was ruthlessly exploited by its primary competitors, Hershey's and Nestlé. These companies, which are in a permanent state of war with Mars for shelf space and share of stomach, were the silent winners of the 2022 redesign drama. They did not have to spend a single dollar on attack ads. They simply maintained their neutral branding. Hershey's, in particular, positioned itself as the classic, traditional, and non-political American chocolate, and it quietly absorbed the 2 to 5% of conservative consumers who were boycotting M&M's. The analysis of this period is clear. The M&M's brand, a 70-year-old icon of neutral fun, made a catastrophic, unforced error. By attempting to fix a brand that was not broken, the company's marketing team stumbled into the single most divisive battlefield in American culture. This single decision created a perfect storm of external challenges. It triggered a political boycott that cost the brand millions in sales. It gave its competitors a massive, unearned advantage, and it simultaneously exposed the brand to accusations of hypocrisy, reinvigorating the much more dangerous, long-term criticism of its unhealthy core product. This combination of a political, financial, and health-related external crisis, combined with the internal chaos of a 60% spike in employee turnover and a new CEO taking over, created the most dangerous moment in the brand's modern history. The company was now in a fight for its very identity, forcing it into a high-stakes public recovery, the 2023 Super Bowl recovery strategy. By early 2023, the M&M's brand, a 70-year-old icon of American neutrality, was in a state of crisis. The 2022 decision to redesign its spokes candies, most notably swapping the green M&M's high-heeled boots for sneakers and introducing a new inclusive purple character, had backfired catastrophically. The move, intended to resonate with a modern Gen Z audience, had instead been seized upon by conservative media outlets, most notably Fox News and its host Tucker Carlson. They transformed the candy's shoe choice into a global symbol of woke corporate capitalism. The brand was now dangerously politicized. This was not a minor PR issue. It had a direct, measurable financial impact. The company faced an immediate right-wing-led boycott, which contributed to a 2 to 5% drop in sales in the U.S. market. This was a devastating blow, as the U.S. market accounts for 40% of M&M's global revenue. Internally, the situation was chaotic. The marketing team was caught in the crossfire, leading to a collapse in morale and a 60% spike in employee turnover in key divisions. This leadership vacuum was worsened by the exit of CEO Grant Reed in 2022, leaving his successor Paul Weyrauch to inherit a brand that was on fire. The company was trapped. If it doubled down on the inclusive redesign, it would further alienate its conservative customer base. If it caved and returned the sexy boots to the green M&M, it would face a second, equally damaging backlash from the progressive consumers it had been trying to attract. Mars Incorporated, a private secretive company that had avoided public controversy for a century, was now the unwilling center of the American culture war. Its recovery was one of the most masterful, high-risk, and cynical public relations pivots in modern history. The strategy was not to win the culture war, but to change the subject by becoming more absurd than the argument itself. The first move came in January 2023, just weeks before the Super Bowl, the single most expensive advertising slot in the world. The company released a stunning official statement. It was pausing the spokes candies indefinitely. The statement was a masterpiece of ironic, neutral PR. It read in part, "We weren't sure if anyone would even notice, but we now get it. Even a candy's shoes can be polarizing," which was the last thing M&M's wanted. The statement then announced that the divisive spokes candies would be replaced by a new, unifying spokesperson, the beloved, non-controversial comedian Maya Rudolph. This was the neutralization strategy. The company was publicly surrendering. It was taking its political mascots off the board and replacing them with a human comedian. The media, both left and right, reported this as a win for the anti-woke activists. Then came the Super Bowl ad. The public, primed for a safe, funny Maya Rudolph commercial, was shown something bizarre. The ad featured Rudolph rebranding the candy as Ma and Yaz. She advertised new, absurd, candy-coated clam bites. The ad was intentionally confusing, unfunny, and terrible. It was a complete failure, or so it seemed. This was a multi-stage plan. Immediately after the Super Bowl game ended, a second commercial aired. This ad featured the M&M's spokes candies holding a press conference. Red, the leader, announced, "I'm glad to be back because this is what I was made for." The Maya Rudolph clam campaign was revealed to be a joke, a failed PR stunt within the larger PR stunt. The controversial characters, including the inclusive purple, were all back. This was the true brilliance of the recovery. Mars had successfully weaponized the controversy. It had not apologized, nor had it doubled down. It had created a meta-narrative, a joke about a marketing failure. It reframed the entire 12-month woke candy debate as a setup for a single Super Bowl punchline. It had successfully depoliticized the brand by using humor instead of politics. This neutral PR strategy was an immediate success. The media narrative changed from woke candy to clever ad. The boycott fizzled. As the data indicates, this single campaign was the primary driver of an 8% sales increase in the post-drama period. While this public PR war was being fought, Mars was executing a second, much quieter, and more structural recovery. This was the $1 billion sustainable in a generation plan. This was a massive long-term investment designed to counter the other, more dangerous criticism. The one about health, sugar, and corporate responsibility. This $1 billion investment was aimed not at the culture war combatants, but at investors, governments, and health-conscious consumers. The plan included a massive push to reduce virgin plastic in its packaging by 20%, a commitment to sustainable cocoa sourcing, and a reduction in its carbon footprint. This was the serious recovery running in parallel to the funny one. This dual-pronged recovery, a high-visibility, ironic PR campaign to solve the short-term political crisis, and a high-cost, sustainable investment to solve the long-term health and environmental crisis, was incredibly effective. It stabilized the brand and allowed the company to refocus on its real engine of growth, product innovation, and global dominance. The company began pouring its restored R&D budget into new, non-controversial, high-margin products, such as the successful caramel and mocha mudslide flavors. This stabilized the $45 billion a year Mars empire and proved its core private company strength. It had the financial freedom and the long-term patience to ride out a self-inflicted storm. $50 million to buy cool. The 2023 Super Bowl ad campaign, which neutralized the political controversy by embracing humor, was a massive tactical success. It stabilized the brand, ended the consumer boycott, and resulted in an 8% post-drama sales increase in the critical U.S. market. This public relations victory, however, was only one small piece of the company's much larger global dominance strategy. The M&M's brand, while a cultural icon, is only a single component of the massive, diversified, and intensely private $45 billion empire of Mars Incorporated. While the American media was focused on a culture war over the candy's footwear, the M&M's brand was continuing its quiet, systematic expansion across the globe. By 2024, M&M's were sold in over 100 countries and had secured an estimated 15% of the global chocolate candy market. This massive global footprint, particularly the 10% annual growth in Asia, provided a powerful financial shield for the company. The 2 to 5% sales drop in the U.S., while serious, was a manageable regional problem, offset by strong growth in other markets. This global success was achieved through a classic glocalization strategy. Mars learned that it could not simply export its American spokes candies and expect them to resonate. It had to adapt its product. In Japan, the company launched matcha green tea, M&Ms. In India, it developed vegetarian formulas to meet local religious and dietary standards. In Southeast Asia, it introduced flavors like coconut and mango. This product flexibility allowed the brand to penetrate new markets on its own terms, far removed from the political dramas of its home country. But the true structural dominance of the M&M's brand does not come from candy at all. It comes from its parent company's other, far larger divisions. The $45 billion Mars Inc. Corporation is, in effect, two separate companies. One is a massive confectionery business. The other, which is even larger, is one of the world's biggest pet care companies. This diversification was the masterstroke of Forrest Mars Sr. and his sons. By investing heavily in its pet care division over decades, Mars acquired brands like Pedigree, Whiskas, and Royal Canin. This division now accounts for over 50% of the company's total $45 billion revenue. This is the secret to the company's power. The M&M's brand can afford to engage in a high-risk $20 million meme campaign or a $50 million Super Bowl pivot because it is financially backstopped by a completely separate, non-controversial, and high-demand business. While its chief competitor, Hershey's, is almost a pure-play chocolate company, Mars is a diversified conglomerate. The stable recession-proof profits from its pet food and veterinary services divisions provide the capital and the freedom for its confectionery division to be bold, experimental, and even to fail. This is the ultimate analysis of Mars's global dominance. It is a private, family-controlled company that has successfully used a 50% diversification into a healthy, responsible category to financially shield its junk food indulgent category. This structure, which a public Wall Street-driven company would struggle to justify, allows Mars to play the long game. It can absorb short-term political boycotts and invest $1 billion in long-term sustainability plans without worrying about a quarterly stock price panic. The recovery from the 2022 to 2023 drama was a tactical PR success, but the brand's true global dominance is structural, built on a $45 billion foundation of secrecy, family control, and pet food. The $200 million sneaker strategy. The 2022 to 2023 redesign crisis was not the cause of Mars Incorporated's new strategy. It was the symptom of a much larger structural problem. The M&M's brand, while a global icon, was facing a dual front war, product saturation and cultural stagnation. The first and most significant problem was that the company's core product, confectionery, had hit a wall. The global chocolate market is a mature, low-growth industry. In its most valuable markets, like the United States, annual growth had slowed to a mere 3%. The company could not grow simply by selling more candy. This saturation was compounded by the second, more dangerous threat, the war on sugar. Like Coca-Cola, M&M's, as a high-sugar, high-calorie product, was facing immense pressure from public health advocates and governments, resulting in rising legal and compliance costs. The 2022 redesign was a clumsy, failed attempt to solve the second problem, cultural stagnation. The brand was seen as old, a legacy product for parents and children, and it was losing its connection to the cynical, ad-resistant Gen Z demographic, which now accounts for 30% of its customer base. The attempt to modernize the characters by making them inclusive backfired, resulting in a 2 to 5% sales drop in the U.S. and a 30% spike in social criticism. This convergence of crises, a saturated market, a health crisis narrative, and a failed political pivot, forced Mars to execute a far more sophisticated multi-billion-dollar diversification. The reason for this pivot was twofold. First, it needed to create new, high-margin revenue streams outside of the confectionery business to offset its 3% core market saturation. Second, it had to find a new apolitical way to win over Gen Z. a strategy to rebrand its fun identity without tripping into the woke capitalism controversy again. This led to the pivot into fashion, sports, and lifestyle collaborations. This was not a fun side project. It was a core high-stakes business strategy. The first and most high-profile execution of this new strategy was the 2022 collaboration with Adidas. This was not a simple merchandise deal, it was a hype culture event. The partnership produced a limited edition sneaker, the M&M's X Adidas Forum Low 84. This was a high-end premium product, a classic sneaker silhouette reskinned in M&M's iconic yellow with M&M's characters and logos. The effectiveness of this pivot was not measured in long-term sales, but in short-term hype and cultural credibility. The launch was executed using a drop model, a tactic borrowed from streetwear brands like Supreme. The shoes were released in limited quantities, creating a scarcity event. As the data indicates, the entire inventory of 100,000 pairs sold out almost immediately, crashing servers and generating massive free media coverage on fashion and sneakerhead blogs. This was the reason in action. Mars was not trying to sell shoes, it was trying to buy relevance. By partnering with a cool cultural gatekeeper like Adidas, M&M's was successfully co-signing its own brand. It was a multi-million-dollar campaign to tell the 30% of its customers who are Gen Z that M&M's was not just a candy store brand, but a streetwear brand. The $50 million per collab cost, as the data analyzes, was not a product cost. It was a marketing cost. It was a purchase of cultural coolness. This single collaboration was the cornerstone of a new, highly profitable ancillary business. This fashion and merchandise pivot, as the data notes, is responsible for a 10% increase in ancillary revenue, growing into a $200 million per year business for the brand. This new $200 million business is a brilliant risk reduction strategy. The core candy business is low margin and high risk, vulnerable to sugar taxes and health criticism. The new merchandise business is high margin and low risk. A $60 t-shirt or a $150 pair of sneakers has a far higher profit margin than a $1.50 bag of candy. This $200 million revenue stream, therefore, acts as a financial shield, insulating the core business from its own vulnerabilities. It was the first critical step in diversifying the brand away from the product that had made it famous. Diversification into sports. The 2022 Adidas collaboration was a hype strategy, a high-impact, short-term event designed to generate cultural credibility and prove that M&M's could function as a fashion brand. It was a top-of-funnel move to capture the attention of the Gen Z demographic. However, hype is temporary. To create a sustainable, long-term lifestyle brand, Mars needed a second, more permanent pillar of cultural integration. This led to the pivot into Major League Sports sponsorships, specifically its 2023 to 2025 partnership with the NBA. This move was a classic and incredibly expensive marketing play. The reason for this diversification was threefold. First, it was a pure demographic play. The NBA's audience is a perfect overlap with the M&M's target consumer. The league's viewership is young, digitally native, and highly engaged with both fashion and social media. Sponsoring the NBA was a direct multi-million-dollar buy to gain access to the 30% of its customers who are Gen Z. It was a way to ensure the M&M's brand was a constant presence in their daily entertainment. Second, it was a defensive strategy against the political drama of 2022. The woke capitalism boycott, which had caused a 2 to 5% sales drop, was a red state versus blue state political fight. The NBA while having its own political leanings, is one of the few purple cultural institutions left that unites a broad cross-section of American consumers. Sponsoring the NBA was a neutralizing move. It was an attempt to shift the brand's identity away from the divisive political conversation and back to the unifying territory of sports, fun, and entertainment. Third, it was a brand synergy play. The M&M's brand, with its colorful, character-driven spokes candies, is built on the concept of a team of different personalities. This perfectly mirrored the team dynamic of the NBA. This synergy allowed the company to create marketing campaigns that were not just M&M's presence the NBA, but were deeply integrated into the fan experience. The effectiveness of this pivot was significant. The sponsorship, which included on-jersey patches for certain teams and major presence at tentpole events like the NBA All-Star Game, gave the brand a massive 20% visibility increase in the U.S. market, as the data indicates. But the true effectiveness was in the integration. M&M's did not just put its logo on the court, it used its characters. The fun, playful M&M's characters were featured in advertisements alongside NBA superstars, creating a fun-on-fun association. This reinforced the $200 million per year merchandise business. A fan who bought the $150 M&M's X Adidas sneaker was now seeing that same cool brand associated with their favorite NBA player. This created a feedback loop where the hype fashion pivot and the mainstream sports pivot reinforced each other, making the brand feel both exclusive and ubiquitous at the same time. This $50 million per collab cost was a high-stakes investment, but it was a necessary one. It was a direct counter-move to its chief competitor, Hershey's, which had its own long-standing sports partnerships. This pivot was not just advertising, it was an act of cultural territory claiming. Mars was using its massive $45 billion checkbook to buy a permanent multi-year residency for its brand inside the single most important cultural ecosystem for young American consumers. This, combined with the fashion pivot, was the 1-2 punch designed to rebrand M&M's as a cultural icon, not a candy product. Analysis of the lifestyle pivot. The pivots into Adidas and the NBA were not isolated campaigns. They were the two primary pillars of a new, unified lifestyle business unit. The reason for this, as the data indicates, was to build a new, high-margin revenue stream to offset the 3% annual growth saturation of the core candy business. This new division, which includes all merchandise, licensing, and collaborations, became a critical financial and marketing weapon. The effectiveness of this strategy must be analyzed in two parts: the direct financial impact and the indirect cultural impact. First, the direct financial impact. This diversification into fashion and lifestyle generated a new ancillary business worth $200 million per year. This is a crucial figure. This $200 million in revenue, which represents a 10% increase in ancillary sales, is not low-margin candy revenue. It is high-margin licensing and apparel revenue. A $150 pair of Adidas sneakers or a $70 NBA jersey patch collaboration has a vastly superior profit margin to a $1.50 bag of M&M's. This $200 million business, therefore, acts as a financial shield. It is a successful risk diversification strategy. The core candy business is vulnerable to the war on sugar and rising commodity costs. The lifestyle business is completely insulated from these risks. This high-margin revenue stream helps to protect the company's overall profitability from the volatility of its core product. The high cost of this strategy, noted as $50 million per collaboration, must be understood in this context. A $50 million investment in an NBA sponsorship is not a traditional advertising cost. It is a capital investment in a new business vertical. It is a customer acquisition cost for the 30% of its customers who are Gen Z. The 20% visibility increase and the 25% engagement increase are the return on investment that the company uses to justify this massive expense. Second, the indirect cultural impact. This strategy was a direct apolitical response to the 2022 redesign crisis. The company had learned a painful lesson. Overtly engaging in identity politics was a high-risk, low-reward gamble that led to a 2 to 5% sales drop and a 30% spike in social criticism. The fashion and sports pivot was a much safer, more neutral way to achieve the same goal. The Adidas and NBA partnerships were designed to rebrand the company's fun identity without the political risk. Instead of telling the public its characters were inclusive, the company showed its characters as cool by placing them in the neutral cultural ecosystems of sports and fashion. This strategy was a direct attempt to counteract the politicization drama. It was a way of changing the conversation. This pivot was designed to defang the brand, moving its identity away from the divisive culture war and back to the unifying territory of professional sports and hype fashion. The analysis of this strategy, however, reveals a new set of risks. The user outline correctly identifies the fad trends risk. The hype model, which was so effective with the 100,000 pair Adidas sellout, is a high-speed cultural treadmill. A cool collaboration in 2022 can become cringe and dated by 2025. The company is now in a permanent high-cost race to find the next cool partner, a race that is expensive and carries the risk of a major financial loss if they bet on the wrong trend. This fad risk is also geographically limited. A $150 Adidas sneaker collaboration has massive cultural resonance in the US and Europe, but it has almost zero relevance in its key globalization growth markets, like India or Southeast Asia. This means the company's most effective Gen Z strategy is also its least global, forcing it to run two completely different and very expensive marketing playbooks simultaneously. The pivots into fashion and sports were a sophisticated, high-cost, and relatively safe strategy. They were a one-to-one swap of capital for cultural relevance. Mars Inc. was paying $50 million to partner with established non-controversial entities to build its fun identity and its $200 million merchandise business. This was a traditional, if expensive, brand-building exercise. But the second and far more controversial diversification was not a deliberate partnership. It was a high-risk internal cultural pivot that backfired and was then, in a brilliant act of corporate judo, weaponized as a public relations opportunity. This was the politicization and media strategy. This entire saga began in January 2022. The M&M's Spokes candies, which had been introduced in 1954, were one of the most successful and beloved pieces of branding in the world. They were, for 70 years, completely apolitical. However, the brand's marketing team, in a decision that would be debated for years, saw a new reason to change. They were under pressure to modernize the brand and make it inclusive to align with the social values of its target Gen Z demographic. This was a direct attempt to pivot the brand from fun to purpose-driven. The company announced a global purpose-led update for its characters. The changes were, on their face, subtle. The green M&M, who had been marketed for decades with a sexy persona and high-heeled go-go boots, had her footwear swapped for cool, laid-back sneakers. The brown M&M, another female character whose identity was intelligent but also wore high heels, had her stilettos swapped for lower, more professional block heels. The reason, the company stated, was to make the female characters more representative of the consumer and empowered. This was followed by the introduction of a new purple M&M character, the first new spokes candy in a decade. The purple character was designed to represent acceptance and inclusivity and was widely interpreted by the public as the brand's first LGBTQ plus representative. This was a deliberate pivot into the culture war. Mars, a historically secretive and risk-averse company, had decided to publicly align its flagship candy brand with progressive social values. The company had failed to anticipate the effectiveness of this move on a different and very powerful segment of its consumer base. The external challenge was immediate and ferocious. The redesign was seized upon by conservative media outlets, most notably Fox News and its then highest-rated host, Tucker Carlson. Carlson dedicated multiple viral segments to the M&M's redesign, mocking it as a prime example of woke capitalism. He famously and absurdly declared that the woke M&Ms were less sexy and that the inclusive candy was unfun. This was not a minor PR issue. It was a political firestorm. The brand overnight became a global symbol of the woke corporate movement. This immediately triggered a right-wing consumer boycott. The effectiveness of this backlash was direct and financially damaging. The company's U.S. sales, which account for 40% of its total revenue, suffered a 2 to 5% drop. The brand's social media channels were flooded with a 30% spike in social criticism. The internal drama was equally severe. The marketing team was caught in a pincer movement. They were being attacked by the right for being woke and simultaneously attacked by the left for their cynical, low-effort attempt at corporate inclusion. The internal chaos and collapse in morale was a key factor in the 60% spike in employee turnover in brand divisions. This public relations disaster, which culminated in the retirement of CEO Grant Reed, was a complete, unforced error. This is where the diversification truly began. The company was now in a crisis. It had a politicized asset that was actively losing money and had alienated half of its customer base. It had to make a choice. The company's new leadership, instead of apologizing or doubling down, chose a third, far more radical path. They decided to embrace the absurdity. They pivoted and used the $50 million in legal compliance costs and the controversy itself as the reason for their next, even bigger campaign. By early 2023, the M&M's brand was in a state of crisis. The 2022 woke redesign had failed, resulting in a 2 to 5% sales drop in its most important market. The brand was now a political football, mocked by the right and criticized by the left. The company's new leadership, under CEO Paul Weyrauch, had to solve an impossible problem: how to depoliticize a brand that was now the global face of woke capitalism. This is where the company executed its most brilliant and cynical media diversification. The reason for this pivot was to weaponize the controversy itself. The marketing team, now in full crisis mode, realized that the problem was not the shoes. The problem was the conversation. The only way to win was to change the conversation. They decided to use the controversy as a massive free teaser for their upcoming Super Bowl advertisement. The strategy was a high-risk, multi-stage psyop against the public. In late January 2023, just weeks before the Super Bowl, the M&M's brand released a stunning official statement on its social media channels. It announced that it was pausing the spokes candies indefinitely. The statement, a masterpiece of public relations, read in part, We weren't sure if anyone would even notice, but we now get it. Even a candy's shoes can be polarizing, which was the last thing M&M's wanted. This statement was a deliberate act of surrender. It appeared to be a direct response to the Tucker Carlson segments and the right-wing boycott. The effectiveness was immediate. The same conservative media that had been attacking the brand for a year now celebrated its victory. They had successfully canceled the woke candy. This generated a second massive news cycle with headlines worldwide announcing the death of the spokes candies. The statement then announced that the divisive characters would be replaced by a new unifying spokesperson, the beloved, universally non-controversial comedian Maya Rudolph. This was the neutralization phase of the plan. This was a brilliant diversion. While the public and the media were debating the surrender, M&M's was preparing its real move. The pause was a lie. It was a classic bait and switch. The company was using the $50 million in legal compliance PR costs not to solve the problem, but to build suspense. The effectiveness of this pivot was in its media domination. The brand had successfully turned a 12-month-long political controversy into a cliffhanger for its own Super Bowl ad. It had manufactured a reason for the entire country to watch its upcoming commercial. The Super Bowl ad itself was the punchline. The first ad that aired was intentionally terrible. It featured Maya Rudolph, the new spokesperson, rebranding M&M's as Ma and Yas and advertising absurd, unappetizing, clam-flavored candy bites. For a moment, the audience believed the pause was real and that this was the brand's new terrible direction. Immediately after the game, a second post-game ad aired. This ad featured the M&M's spokes candies at a press conference. Red, the character, announced that the pause was over and that they were back for good. This was the reveal. The entire year-long woke candy controversy, the pause, and the Maya Rudolph campaign were all one giant interconnected PR opportunity. Mars had successfully reframed a damaging year-long political boycott as a simple, clever, short-term advertising stunt. The effectiveness of this was a 1 billion-plus social media view avalanche. The company had not taken a side in the culture war. It had risen above it by turning the entire war into a joke about marketing. The reason this worked was that it gave both sides a win. The right felt they had won by forcing the pause. The left felt they had won because the inclusive characters were brought back. The financial effectiveness was immediate. The 2 to 5% sales drop from the boycott was instantly reversed. The brand saw a 5% sales recovery in the U.S. and a total 8% sales increase in the post-drama period. This politicization pivot was a high-risk, high-cost, and wildly successful strategy. It proved that a brand could, in fact, diversify into controversy itself and use the media's own outrage as a tool for brand freshening. The analysis, however, is that this was a dangerous one-time gimmick. It was a brilliant solution to a unique crisis, but it also alienated 10% of its conservative customer base permanently. It was a gamble that paid off, but it was not a sustainable long-term business model. It was a short-term, high-cost viral fix. The diversification strategy of M&M's in response to its 3% market saturation and the 2022 redesign crisis must be understood as two distinct parallel operations. The first and arguably more sustainable operation was the safe pivot into fashion and sports. The second, as just analyzed, was the high-risk pivot into politicization and media. The fashion and sports strategy was a classic capital-intensive marketing pivot. The reason for this was purely commercial, to diversify revenue and engage Gen Z. This demographic, which accounts for 30% of its customers, was the primary target. The strategy was to use the fun, apolitical nature of its spokes candies to build a new high-margin business vertical. The Adidas collaboration, which sold out 100,000 pairs of sneakers, was the hype component. It was a top-of-funnel move to generate cultural credibility. The NBA partnership was the mainstream component. It was a mid-funnel move to create mass visibility, achieving a 20% increase in the U.S. market. The effectiveness of this combined strategy was, first and foremost, financial. As the user data indicates, this pivot was directly responsible for creating a $200 million per year merchandise and licensing business. This represents a 10% increase in ancillary revenue. This is the single most important part of the diversification analysis. It created a stable, high-margin business that was completely insulated from the company's core risks. This $200 million revenue stream acts as a financial shield. The core candy business is vulnerable to the war on sugar and rising commodity costs. The lifestyle business is not. This ancillary revenue helps to offset the $50 million in annual legal and compliance costs associated with the health criticisms of its core product. The high cost of this strategy, noted as $50 million per collaboration, must be understood in this context. A $50 million investment in an NBA sponsorship is not a traditional advertising cost. It is a capital investment in a new business vertical. It is a customer acquisition cost for the 30% of its customers who are Gen Z. The 20% visibility increase and the 25% engagement increase are the return on investment that the company uses to justify this massive expense. This fashion and sports pivot was also a critical defensive strategy against the 2022 redesign drama. While the politicization crisis was raging on one front, the NBA and Adidas partnerships were a safe harbor for the brand. They were a way to change the subject and remind consumers of the brand's fun, apolitical identity. It was a direct, well-funded counter-narrative to the woke capitalism criticism. However, this safe strategy is not without its own significant long-term risks. The user outline correctly identifies the fad trends, risk. The hype model, which was so effective with the 100,000 pair Adidas sellout, is a high-speed cultural treadmill. A cool collaboration in 2022 can become cringe and dated by 2025. The company is now in a permanent high-cost race to find the next cool partner. A race that is expensive and carries the risk of a major financial loss if they bet on the wrong trend. This fad risk is also geographically limited. A $150 Adidas sneaker collaboration has massive cultural resonance in the US and Europe, but it has almost zero relevance in its key globalization growth markets, like India or Southeast Asia. This means the company's most effective Gen Z strategy is also its least global, forcing it to run two completely different and very expensive marketing playbooks simultaneously. The modern diversification of the M&M's brand, therefore, must be analyzed as two distinct and seemingly contradictory strategies that were executed in parallel. The first strategy was the proactive pivot into fashion and sports. This was a high-cost, capital-intensive, but safe cultural investment. The $50 million per collaboration cost for partners like Adidas and the NBA was a straightforward transaction. Mars Inc. was using its massive $45 billion checkbook to buy cultural relevance. This strategy was highly effective, generating a stable $200 million per year merchandise business and increasing U.S. loyalty by 15%. This was a classic top-down corporate-driven diversification. The second strategy was the reactive pivot into politicization and media. This was not a planned investment, it was a desperate and brilliant response to a self-inflicted crisis. The 2022 redesign drama, which caused a 2 to 5% sales drop and a 30% spike in social criticism, was a massive, unforced error. However, the company's ability to weaponize this controversy, as demonstrated by the Maya Rudolph Super Bowl campaign, was a masterclass in modern public relations. This reactive pivot, as the data indicates, generated 1 billion plus social media views and led to a 5 to 8% sales recovery. The effectiveness of the M&M's diversification strategy can only be understood by looking at how these two playbooks work together. The safe pivot provided a constant apolitical baseline of fun and coolness. This baseline recentered the brand, giving it the cultural armor it needed to survive the high-risk political pivot. The politicization drama, in turn, while damaging, generated a level of media noise and relevance that no $50 million sponsorship could ever buy. This two-pronged approach was a direct data-driven response to the brand's core weaknesses. The $200 million merchandise business is a high-margin financial shield that directly counters the low-margin, high-risk candy business, which is vulnerable to sugar taxes and health criticism. The brand tribe built through fashion and sports is an emotional shield that counters the 2 to 5% sales drops from political boycotts. This entire complex and expensive new model has simply traded one set of risks for another. The old M&M's was vulnerable to product risk and stagnation risk. The new M&M's has solved those problems, but has acquired a new, far more volatile set of cultural risks. The brand's reliance on fad trends, as the user outline analyzes, is the central vulnerability of the fashion pivot. The hype that sold 100,000 pairs of Adidas sneakers is, by its nature, temporary. The brand is now on a high-speed cultural treadmill, and the $50 million per collaboration cost is the annual fee it must now pay to stay relevant. The politicization pivot has an even more dangerous risk: brand polarization. The 2023 Super Bowl ad, while brilliant, was a one-time trick. It did not unpoliticize the brand, it just successfully changed the subject. The brand, as the data notes, permanently lost an estimated 10% of its conservative customer base. It has traded this established older demographic for the promise of the 35% Gen Z market. This was a high-stakes, strategic gamble that has permanently reshaped the brand's consumer base. Finally, this entire lifestyle strategy is geographically limited. The woke candy debate and the Adidas drop were massive culture-defining events in the US and, to some extent, Europe. They had zero cultural resonance in the brand's key globalization growth markets, like Asia, which are responsible for its 10% annual growth. This means the company's most effective Gen Z strategy is also its least global, forcing it to run two completely different and very expensive marketing playbooks simultaneously: private structure and sustainability. The history of Mars, incorporated in its flagship brand, M&M's, provides a set of core lessons in business branding and crisis management. The company's $45 billion success is not accidental. It is the result of a unique multi-generational corporate structure and a series of hard-won, often expensive lessons. A foundational element of the company's DNA is the power of a diversified, privately held structure. The Mars family's decision to keep the company 100% private is the single most important element of its success. This family control provides a massive strategic advantage: patience. Because Mars is private, it is completely insulated from the short-term, quarterly demands of Wall Street shareholders. This freedom is what allowed it to make the massive, long-term, multi-billion-dollar investment in its pet care division. This diversification, which now accounts for 50% of its total revenue, is the brand's financial shield. A public, shareholder-driven company would have faced immense pressure to spin off this unrelated business. The Mars family, in contrast, used the stable, high-margin profits from pet care to fund the high-risk, high-cost meme campaigns for its confectionery division. This pet care buffer is the financial engine that allows M&M's to spend $50 million on a single collaboration or to absorb a 2 to 5% sales drop from a political boycott without a stock price collapse. This structure is the key to its 5 to 10% annual growth, as it provides the ultimate hedge against candy saturation. This private control also explains the company's internal drama, the generational transfer issues, such as the 1932 split between Frank Mars and Forrest Mars Sr., are the risk of this model. The 60% spike in employee turnover following the 2022 redesign crisis was a direct result of this insular top-down family culture, which can be slow to react and can misjudge the public mood. This leads to the next critical lesson: managing political and social risk. The 2022 redesign scandal was the company's most significant modern failure. It was a painful public lesson in the dangers of politicizing a neutral brand. The company's attempt to be inclusive by changing the character's shoes was a massive, unforced error. It was not a product decision. It was a political one, and it backfired. It alienated a core part of its customer base, and it invited accusations of hypocrisy. The recovery, however, was the real lesson. The 2023 Maya Rudolph Super Bowl ad was a masterclass in neutralization. The company learned that the only way to win the culture war is to not play. By using humor to pivot away from politics, it successfully reframed the entire 12-month controversy as a joke. This was a brilliant, high-cost way to de-escalate. The lesson is to avoid polarization, and if you fail, use humor to change the subject. This pivot was directly responsible for the 8% post-drama sales recovery. However, it was a costly lesson, and as the data shows, it permanently alienated an estimated 10% of its conservative customer base. This pivot was part of a broader strategy of diversification through cultural co-signing. The M&M's brand was facing a saturation problem and an age problem. The lifestyle pivot was the solution. The Adidas collaboration and the NBA partnership were not just ancillary revenue. They were a strategic cosign. By partnering with cool and mainstream cultural gatekeepers, M&M's was buying relevance. This was a brilliant financial and marketing move. It created a new high-margin $200 million per year merchandise business, a 10% increase in ancillary revenue that is completely insulated from the war on sugar, and its $50 million in annual legal costs. This $50 million per collab strategy was a direct investment in the 30% Gen Z market. The lesson is that lifestyle marketing is not just PR. It is a financial shield that uses hype to build a new profitable business vertical, which in turn protects the legacy core product from its own weaknesses. This entire multi-pronged strategy of cultural co-signing and crisis weaponization is only possible because of the final and most important lesson from the Mars Incorporated history: the strategic power of a private, family-controlled, diversified portfolio. The user outlines analysis of family sustainability is the key to the entire $45 billion empire. Mars is not a public company. It is a 100% family-owned dynasty, and this private status is its ultimate competitive advantage. This family control is the reason The company can operate on a multi-generational timeline, a luxury a public-facing CEO who must answer to Wall Street every 90 days does not have. This patience is what allowed Forrest Mars Sr. and his sons to make the single most important diversification in the company's history, the massive decades-long investment into its pet care division. This pivot, which began in the mid-20th century, was a masterstroke of risk diversification. Today, as the data confirms, Mars's pet care division, which includes brands like Pedigree, Whiskas, and a massive network of veterinary hospitals, accounts for over 50% of the company's total $45 billion revenue. This is the secret to the M&M's brand's resilience. The confectionery business, with its 3% market saturation and high-profile sugar criticisms, is the public face of the company. The pet care business is the silent, non-controversial, high-demand financial engine. This pet food money is the financial shield that makes the entire M&M's lifestyle strategy possible. It provides the billions in stable, non-correlated cash flow that allows the candy division to take massive, high-risk, fun gambles, such as the $50 million per collaboration costs for Adidas or the $20 million meme campaigns. It is the engine room that funds the cultural experiments. When the M&M's brand suffered a 2 to 5% sales drop from a political boycott, it was a marketing problem, not a corporate crisis, because the pet care division was simultaneously posting record growth. This private, diversified structure is what allows Mars to play the long game. It can absorb the $50 million in annual legal costs from sugar criticism without a stock price panic. It can also invest in massive, long-term, nonprofit-driven initiatives like its $1 billion Sustainable in a Generation plan. This sustainability plan is the final modern lesson. The company learned from the 2022 redesign crisis that social responsibility is a new and volatile battleground. The $1 billion investment in sustainable sourcing and 20% plastic reduction is not just PR. It is a preemptive brand shield. It is a direct, data-driven move to build brand integrity and authenticate its inclusive marketing. It is the company's defense against the next woke capitalism crisis, a way to prevent accusations of hypocrisy. Ultimately, the lesson of M&M's is a story of contradictions. The brand's formation was a brilliant wartime innovation. Its growth was driven by a marketing innovation. Its modern crisis was a self-inflicted political miscalculation. Its recovery was a masterful PR pivot and a lifestyle diversification. But the true lesson is that all of this, the $200 million merchandise business, the $50 million collaborations, the 15% loyalty increase, is only possible because of the structural integrity of its parent Mars Incorporated. The Mars family's greatest innovation was not the M&M. It was the creation of a private, diversified $45 billion financial fortress that allows its brands to be fun, experimental, and playful, all while being funded by the separate, serious, and immensely profitable business of pet food. This dual structure is what ensures its continued 5 to 10% annual growth and its position as one of the most powerful and secretive companies in the world.